Hello everyone, welcome to the Sutton Trust webinar on closing the attainment gap between disadvantaged students and their better off peers. My name is Eleanor Busby. I'm the education correspondent at PA Media News Agency, more widely known as Press Association. I will be chairing the event today, which will consider the possible drivers of the attainment gap, which has grown considerably since schools were forced to close their doors to the majority of children in the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll look at what policymakers and schools can do to tackle it. The attainment gap has been gradually decreasing, or had been in the early 2010s, but since the pandemic, the gap has widened largely, reversing years of progress. With school absent rates increasing and families facing greater pressures due to the cost of living crisis, there are concerns that disadvantaged students could be left further behind unless action is taken soon. With a general election looming, although we don't know exactly when that's going to be, our four panelists will discuss what they believe the main political parties should be prioritising to address the educational inequality across England, and what commitments they would like to see from politicians going forward. Each speaker will individually share their thoughts and possible solutions for closing the attainment gap, and then we will have a Q&A. I will first ask some questions before opening up the floor to the audience. You'll be able to share any questions you'd like to ask through the Q&A function on Zoom. The webinar will be recorded and shared after the event. So first up, our speakers today are Carl Cullinane, Director of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust charity. Carl has authored a number of reports on subjects including the impact of the COVID pandemic on learning, student finance, unpaid internships and school admissions. He's also co-investigator on the COSMO study, which is a major longitudinal study examining the impact of the pandemic on education and inequality and social mobility. Sir Kevin Collins, the government's former education catch-up czar, is also on the panel today. Sir Kevin hit the headlines in June 2021 when he resigned from his role as England's Education Recovery Commissioner, as he warned the government's £1.4 billion catch-up package fell far short of what was needed. He'd been appointed to the role just 4 months before to oversee a programme for pupils who'd missed out on learning during the pandemic. So Kevin is Vice Chair at Learning by Questions, an education technology company, and he also chairs the Youth Endowment Fund, which was set up by the Home Office to look at the evidence around what works to reduce youth crime and violence. We're also joined today by Hannah Brinston, who is Head of Policy and Advocacy at the Food Foundation charity. Hannah oversees the charity's portfolio of policy and government engagement activities. Prior to joining the Food Foundation, Hannah was at the World Obesity Foundation for over a decade, where she worked across a range of issues, including childhood obesity, food systems, and healthcare. Darren Northcott, the National Official for Education at the NASUW Teaching Union, is our fourth speaker on the panel today. Darren began his career as a primary school teacher and has worked at schools in Newham, East London and in Cheshire. Prior to joining NASUWT as a National Official for Education, he was a national officer at the FDA, the Senior Civil and Public Services Union. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Carl Cullinane, Director of Research and Policy at the Sutton Trust, who will share some of the charity's recommendations for closing the attainment gap and some of the charity's research findings.
Great, thank you very much, Eleanor. Nice to speak to everyone today. So just getting that presentation running. So my role is just to talk through quickly and give a bit of framing to the event today. I mean, the first thing to emphasize is that this is one of the Sutton Trust's 3 main priorities ahead of the upcoming general election, alongside early years and student maintenance. And we really think this is absolutely crucial at this stage, that we really need concerted action and concerted attention on this issue. I suppose the first point of clarification to make is, what are we talking about when we say the attainment gap? So there are lots of attainment gaps by different characteristics, ethnicity, gender, etc., and at different stages of education. But here we're talking about the attainment gap in school, and particularly the socioeconomic attainment gap between those from more and less well-off backgrounds. And in the main, that is measured by in schools by eligibility for free school meals. The kind of derived pupil premium measure of eligibility for FSM of the previous 6 years. There are a lot of questions about that measure as a measure of socioeconomic disadvantage. It's certainly not perfect, and there are issues around tracking it over time as well as eligibility has changed. But it is the best one we have, I think, in terms of seeing what the patterns are. So I suppose the first thing to emphasize, I think, is that the attainment gap opens up before children ever enter school. So it opens up from a, as soon as a child is born, in terms of the speed of their development, and is impacted by a range of factors, including the home learning environment, health issues, access to food, and issues around parents, access to early years education, and other factors as well. So by the time kids get at school, there's already a big gap between those from different types of households. And this graph from Education Policy Institute shows how the gap starts off at that stage, but grows over their time in school. So by the end of primary school, it has doubled, and by the end of GCSE, it's almost doubled again. In terms of Key Stage 5, things get a bit more complicated because obviously people take a big diversity of routes, and it gets harder to measure at that age. The second thing to talk about, I suppose, that's important is how it has changed over time. As Eleanor mentioned, between 2010 and around 2017, we saw a gradual improvement in terms of the disadvantage attainment gap. And here we see the Department for Education's disadvantage gap index at Key Stage 2, so at the end of primary school. And we see improvement from 2010-11 back down to 2017 or so, where it levels off. And then we see a massive jump post-pandemic, when testing and exams came back. At Key Stage 4, you see quite a similar pattern, that of gradual improvement. It stabilizes again around 2017-18, where the improvement basically stops, and then disimproves substantially again since the pandemic. And as in, I think, practically all of the measures at different stages of education, any progress made since about 2011 has been erased. The gap is at the highest it's been since that time, basically. So what are the drivers of the attainment gap? And they're complex and overlapping, and there isn't time to get into all of those in detail now, but it's a complex and overlapping picture of home factors, school factors, and area neighborhood factors. So the home, issues around home learning environment, parental education and support, issues around financial resources in terms of education specific. So for example, private tutoring and inequalities and access to that, but also financial resources in terms of household finances and food issues around food poverty, that I'm sure Hannah will speak around, issues around family stress due to financial circumstances, parental mental health, and also issues around housing tenure, quality, and security and consistency of tenure. And they all impact children's experiences and education. A variety of school factors, from the socioeconomic profile, the quality of teaching they have access to, the levels of funding their school has access to, extracurricular opportunities, as well as specific interventions and programs for disadvantaged young people. And then in terms of area factors, you've a variety of factors, including proximity to educational institutions, the general character of the area, deprivation, crime, antisocial behavior, peer effects from who you're surrounded by throughout your childhood, and proximity to other resources, cultural resources, leisure resources, etc. So in terms of what we need to do about it, it's a massive problem. It's a very holistic problem, and there are no magic bullets. And so I suppose the Sutton Trust is saying that we need a national mission to address this issue. This should be a huge priority for the next government. And B, we need a variety of measures if we're to tackle this seriously. There's no one thing that's going to solve it. And you can see that the 10 issues here across various categories, including funding, so reforming the national funding formula, which from 27...
Sorry to disrupt you. Just if you don't mind wrapping up your comments. I know there's lots of recommendations. But,
yes. So so specifically around funding for schools, pupil premium funding, the national tutoring program obviously looks like it's been discontinued. We also need to look at the underlying issues around poverty and child poverty and how that impacts kids in schools. We need to look at the general picture of social segregation and look at school admissions. But it's not just about funding, it's also about how it's spent, and it's about building evidence and scaling up interventions that work to narrow the attainment gap. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. So sorry for interrupting you, just to want to make sure everyone gets their turn. Next, we'll hear from Sir Kevin Collins, the former Education Recovery Commissioner, who will share his insights on the topic. So over to you, Sir Kevin.
Thanks, Eleanor. And it's good to come after Carl, as he set it out so well. Like Darren, my background, I started teaching over 40 years ago in East London and Bradford were the two places I served. And this issue of how do you meet the children who arrive at school from families that face more economic challenges has been, if you like, I think the standout mission, to use that phrase, Carl, of our generation of educators, and remains so. Because there's so much that's good about the English education system, but this is the one problem, the one intractable issue we've never really solved, and yet we've solved so many others. I think it's really important for me that we don't look back through pre-COVID with rose-tinted specs. We had done good work, and we were beginning to close the gap, but on any analysis, it was going to take us decades to get to the point when we'd actually got rid of that gap. So we weren't actually going fast enough. The big challenge is that the social and economic architecture of our society means that some children, as Carl has said, arrive at school with a risk of education disadvantage. You can't remove that risk. Well, education can't alone anyway. So you're faced, I think, with 4 obligations. I think the first is you have to tackle the direct implications of being poor. Finance, access to public services. This might mean, how affordable are school uniforms? Can every child go on a school trip? Sometimes, can you provide access to the essentials, food and resources that children need? You just have to face those things directly and meet them and not talk about them too much, just get on and do it. I think the second is you have to adapt to the needs of children. So there's a question here of, and it's a bit of an ugly phrase in education, but is there a pedagogy of poverty? I don't think poor children learn differently, but there may well be an emphasis in your teaching that meets the needs of children who come with disadvantage. So for example, in the early years, we know that language and communication really matters. You might have to wade in with more so children have more access to language. In primary schools, leaving with good literacy and numeracy skills are essential for long-term success. We know that correlation, and therefore we have to focus on getting those things right, particularly when children arrive at school with less kind of, it's like education capital. And in secondary schools, I think we need to do so much more on information, advice and guidance, the pathways on to the next stage of learning. It's all well and good when you sit around a dinner table and people can map the pathway to be a doctor or a lawyer. It's very different when someone tries to help you understand how to become a plumber or a heating engineer. We need to make sure that these pathways are open and accessible to all. And then I think the third obligation is to mitigate the impact. Again, because we can't remove this, but we can do something about the impact. When you look at the accountability and the incentive structures in schools, so admissions, are we really making sure that our disadvantaged kids get access to all schools of choice? It doesn't look like it when you look at the data. Are we allocating teachers and our staff and our resources to teach the hardest to teach children, if you like? Doesn't look like it, again, when you look at the data. If you look at something like Ofsted, why is it easier to get an outstanding judgment when you work and teach in a school that has less disadvantaged kids? That's a perverse incentive in terms of going to schools where you get that kind of reward from something like Ofsted. And then and then structures like the pupil premium. We must protect that. It's essential, as well as Carl said, tutoring. I think it was such a shame, as tutoring was one of the first times we were beginning to move the furniture and do something fundamental to give children more opportunities. And it looks like that's withering because the government won't continue to fund it. And then the final obligation, I think, is to break the cycle. Because one of the pernicious things about disadvantage is that it's a cycle that just keeps repeating itself in too many communities and families. How do we build the alliances and the partnerships that disrupt these pathways so it doesn't become inevitable, that actually you can change the life circumstance of not only the child, but the children of the child. So this takes you back to pre and antenatal care, early years, out of school youth clubs, recreation, pathways to work and vocational education. This might sound fanciful, but actually the reference points to promise here aren't in faraway places. You don't need to get on a plane and jet somewhere else. The reference points are in our own country. If you look at the child who's born with disadvantage, and if they're born in London, why are their prospects so much different from the child who's born poor, where I come from in Derbyshire? We need to work out how do we support all schools to do the kind of things that our best schools are doing and our best communities are doing, and make that access, if you like, to knowledge and expertise much more open. The final thing I'd say, that dealing with this issue isn't only about supporting the children who come from disadvantage. The drag and lag of disadvantage holds all children back. It has value to the whole society, not only to release the potential of those children who aren't succeeding, but also if you take an example like when we put breakfast clubs into schools, what we found in the research the EEF did, over 10,000 children in that study, it was only the children who got the breakfast that benefited, but actually all of the peers, all of the children in the class benefited because the culture changed, less disruption, children more attentive. So supporting disadvantaged children to succeed actually supports all children to succeed.
Thank you very much, Sir Kevin. If we now hear from Hannah Brinston, the Head of Policy and Advocacy at the Food Foundation, who will discuss the impact of food poverty on children and their education. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me on this webinar today. As said, I work at a charity called the Food Foundation, and we really focus on ensuring access and affordability of healthy diets for everyone. So I think a bit of perspective on sort of what's going on related to food poverty is kind of what I can bring today. So we track food insecurity at the Food Foundation, and we published our latest survey last month, and that showed that about 8 million adults and 3 million children are affected by food insecurity at the moment. And what we're seeing is a much greater proportion of this impacting households with children. So it's about 20% of households with children are affected by food insecurity, and this is even higher in single parent households. So this is quite worrying to show that there are a large number of children who are affected by food insecurity. What we also found in this most recent survey is a really significant reduction in purchases of fruit, vegetables, milk and fish amongst those who are living in food insecurity. So this shows the kind of impact that being food insecure can actually have on the quality of diets. Sorry, you put your hand up, but yeah, that's it. And we also know that sort of overall lower income households, while the sort of consumption of fat, sugar and salt isn't necessarily that much different to the rest of the population, that there is generally a lower consumption of fruit, vegetables and fibre. So this is kind of worrying from a child's perspective, because it could impact you know, their development and their general health, which then has an impact as they get older. We also know, you know, in the cost of living crisis that food prices are increasing, which is further exacerbating these issues. So food prices have increased by about 25%. Healthy food is about twice as expensive as unhealthy food. And the most deprived fifth in society would have to spend about 50% of their disposable income to achieve the recommended healthy diet, compared to just 11% of the least deprived. So again, this all kind of shows a picture of the impact that sort of food insecurity, food poverty can have actually on access to healthy diets. We know from various studies that have been done, not just in the UK, that food insecurity can sort of have an impact on the mental health of children, as well as on their physical health, and can kind of impact concentration and behaviour. Which from a learning perspective is worrying. And And we also know that there's kind of, as I say, higher levels sometimes of kind of mental health issues around like depression and things like that. So this just really shows the impact that this can have outside of what we typically talk around, like obesity and things like that, but actually there are much wider impacts that this can have on children. And there's also evidence of where there has been sort of nutritional supplementation or access to sort of free school meals in schools, so that can actually boost concentration again. So that demonstrates the kind of the power of good nutrition for actually supporting our children. So we would very much support the sort of recommendations of the Sutton Trust around extending free school meals to a larger number of pupils. We actually go one step further and say, and are calling for an extension to universal credit households as a first step towards universal free school meals, recognising that there's a huge number of benefits from having everybody sit together and eat a school meal together, including to kind of reduce some of the stigma that can be attached to having free school meals. So I think the school food environment can be a really powerful tool for kind of bringing everyone along the same journey. The other sort of policy recommendation that I think relates here is around the support for children over the holidays. We know that actually there's quite a lot of weeks in the year when children are not in school, and particularly again for those disadvantaged households, those that are accessing free school meals. It's really important that we make sure that provisions are in place over the holidays. So there's a holiday activity and food support program in place at the moment, which I believe funding is committed until the end of the year. But that really ensures that sort of families are able to access that sort of healthy, nutritious food for children over the holidays, so that when they come back to school, they've kind of had that sustained better nutrition. And then across both of that, also from the basis of ensuring that it's not just about eating, but it's eating good food, are also working towards having school standards improved, just to make sure that children are actually accessing healthy food when they're in school as well. So I will stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And our final speaker will be Darren Northcott, the National Official for Education at the NASUWT Teaching Union, who will share his insights. Thanks very much, Darren.
Thank you very much, Eleanor, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm from the NSWT Teaching Union. We have coming up to 300,000 teacher and leader members right across the UK. I say the UK because that provides us with quite a neat exercise in compare and contrast, because in the UK, we've got 4 different education systems, all facing comparable challenges. But each of those systems sometimes tries to address those challenges in very different ways. And there are things I think we can learn from each other, but I'll just confine my remarks to the situation in England. I'll start by saying, as Kevin said, I think teachers and leaders have long recognised the impact that socioeconomic disadvantage can have on children and young people's educational outcomes. Recognising that doesn't mean that teachers and leaders have low aspirations or expectations for those pupils. It simply means that they recognise that those factors can create barriers to progress and achievement. So addressing those barriers and ensuring that every child can achieve and succeed is central to the mission of schools. Our members tell us that all the time. And there are factors beyond the school gate that are within the domain of broader social and economic policy. And schools cannot, you hear this a lot, but I'll repeat it. I mean, schools cannot be held solely responsible for the attainment gap. Though many in schools sometimes feel that's a position that is directed towards them often. But schools absolutely have a critical role to play in removing those barriers to achievement. And there are lots of factors that I think are within the gift or the control or the influence of schools that have an impact in that respect. But I think one I want to focus on in particular, and touch on the others because those matter to our members very much, it is around the impact of the current recruitment and retention crisis that we see in teaching. Because if we don't have enough teachers and leaders in our schools, then all the education interventions that we identify as being potentially effective will always be hindered in that respect. And it is a big crisis. It's the worst recruitment and retention crisis that we've seen in living memory. We've got fewer people contemplating entering teaching, and we've got more serving teachers contemplating or actually leaving teaching. And there may well be, and we can discuss this, they may well be, and I think there's a case for pointing out that there's variability in the extent to which that problem impacts across subjects and across phases and perhaps localities. But I think I would assert that it is still currently, and has been for some time, a genuinely national problem that requires a national solution. I think it requires a national workforce plan, something we haven't had for certainly at least 15 years, because we know what the drivers of that recruitment retention crisis are. So we know, for example, that excessive and unnecessary workload burdens play a big role in that crisis. We know the last time the Talis study included England, which sadly no longer does, the last time that study included England, we know that secondary teachers in England are working well above the OECD average. And we know that for primary teachers, only in Japan were OECD teachers working longer than they do in England. And that situation has deteriorated. We know that pay is an issue. We see massive declines in competitiveness of teachers' pay, real terms cuts of 30% and more since 2010. Pay and career progression. If you want to advance your career as a teacher, we know that barriers in that respect are on in retaining teachers and recruiting as well. A lack of access to that professional development that would support that progression. We see increasing behaviour challenges, and those are cited by many teachers as an area of concern, and a lack of access to sources of external support and expertise in areas such as special educational needs and attendance. And perhaps, I think, increasingly, we see teachers telling us that they often work in an employment environment that does not always reflect what modern graduates want from a working life. They want autonomy, they want respect for their professionalism, they want a genuinely collegiate culture within which to work, and they don't always have that offered to them, which is another deterrent. So some of those issues will take a long time and additional funding to address, but some could be progressed at little or no cost and in relatively short order. But I think I would say that until we develop a genuinely national plan, the teaching and wider school workforce, then the education system will always be constrained in its ability to contribute to the vital work of closing that attainment gap and allowing every child to reach their potential. So just a few comments, and I'll stop there, Eleanor.
Thank you, Darren. That's great. So I will kick off the Q&A, but if anyone has any questions that they haven't already shared, please do put them in the Q&A chat function, and I'll get to them once I've asked a few of my pressing questions of the panelists. So yeah, I'd be keen to hear, I know it came up in a couple of the comments just now about summer and how actually you need to support the children when they're not in school as well. And there's been some suggestions about whether if we were to reduce summer holidays, whether that could help tackle learning loss. The Welsh Government's considering cutting the summer break to 5 weeks and then having a longer half term in October. So I just wondered kind of what the panelists' thoughts were on those proposals. Maybe best to speak to you first, Darren, as it would be probably affecting teachers quite a lot if the summer breaks were cut to 5 weeks, say, for example.
So thanks very much, Eleanor. Not surprising you perhaps came to me first on that. I think the observation I would make is that if we look at Wales, the case for shortening that summer holiday hasn't been made particularly convincingly. And I think one piece of evidence you might want to point to is that if you look at the length of summer holidays in other European countries and jurisdictions, you'll see that the summer break in England and in the UK generally is among the shortest. So we have one of the shortest summer breaks in the whole of Europe and across the OECD. So I think one of the things that's really concerned me about the debate in Wales is that there's been a lot of focus and attention on the length of the holiday, And that's kind of acted as a black hole and distracted attention from all the other interventions and all the other policies to see in order to close the attainment gap there. So I don't think the case for a shorter summer holiday has been made. I think there are lessons we can learn from other jurisdictions that perhaps have had more success than we've had in closing that attainment gap. So from our members' point of view, I'm not sure we would put shortening the summer holiday at the top of the priority list for policy interventions to narrow the attainment gap.
So Kevin, I know that you've kind of said before about maybe lengthening the school day would be something you would support. I just wondered what your thoughts were on shortening summer holidays or lengthening the short day at that.
I'm kind of with Darren really about it being a slightly it diverts us away from the conversation into a sort of one size fits all sort of solution. But I do think there's a genuine question about the access to the resource known as the school. In many communities, these are the very best buildings and assets for children. And I don't think we're making full use of them. Now, it doesn't mean that a teacher's got to be there. It means that we've got to open up these resources for a broader range of activities. I think through the holidays, I think longer days where you can use the resources and have independent study, you can have more competitive sport, choir, drama, whatever it might be, is what I wanted to do, is extend the day for those things. But I do think we need to look again at the time for learning. It's very variable in some schools. Even within the day, some schools are making things like lunchtime very, very short in order to manage behavior. And yet it's at that time when you learn how to behave in a way. So I think there's a whole question about time and access to the resource that's important for children who might not have the same level of access to resources in their own home. And I think we should look again at these buildings and these facilities that we've got. And the other angle, of course, is that the new resource for learning increasingly is through technology. So we not only need access to buildings, we need access to resources. And I think it should become almost a given that every child has access to technology and connectivity to support their learning. Otherwise, that's going to be one of the new drivers of disadvantage if you haven't got that opportunity.
Hannah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess there's two points that I'd like to pick up on there. So, I mean, we don't have a position on the number of weeks in school or on holiday, but I think it's worth noting that the HAF programme, which is the support for families with preschool meals through the holidays, doesn't actually cover all of the holidays. I think it's up to 6 weeks provision across the year. So I think for us, the most important thing is to make sure that children get that support to access nutritious food throughout the whole year, regardless of if they're in school or not, through whatever means that is. And the other point, just around the time of the school day, we did some research with some secondary schools in Yorkshire last year, and they were given the free school meal allowance kind of value and had to go into their school and look at, you know, what they could afford with it. And we were kind of collecting their experiences. And one of the things that came back was they are often not choosing the healthiest or the hot food with that because of the short duration of lunch, which means they don't want to queue up and they don't want to miss time, you know, playing with their friends, doing whatever it is. So I think from a food and nutrition perspective, really integrating that within a school day and sort of seeing the value of the social connection over food is really important, and like giving children that space to actually be able to have, you know, healthy, nutritious food and not sort of forcing in a way towards the kind of paninis and things which we know are not as nutritionally balanced just because of the length of the lunch break.
Carl, is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I suppose the one thing I would say is that, you know, obviously the summer learning loss phenomenon is well known, but I suppose it's not necessarily a silver bullet. In some ways, the summer learning fade is a symptom rather than a cause of an unequal system, you know, and that there are some deeper issues that you need to address as well. And just looking at that in isolation, I think, isn't going to solve all your problems.
There's also been lots of suggestions about what policymakers can do, what schools can do. What can parents do around this issue? I just wondered what people thought about that, how parents can help to try and deal with some of these issues with education inequalities and closing the attainment gap. So Kevin, do you want to give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, because it's such a great question, because parents are, of course, the first and most enduring teachers of children. I mean, what we saw in COVID, we saw schools turn on a sixpence and do amazing things to support online learning. But we saw an ingenuity in our children to respond to new ways of learning. But we saw parents lean in and get engaged. Maybe after a while it got tricksy, but they leant in and got engaged in children's learning in really exciting ways. And one of my disappointments is we haven't sort of captured that legacy, because then we've moved to a debate around fining parents and being more kind of having a different kind of relationship with parents as partners and parents involved in children's learning. Nothing trumps it. The evidence is really clear, but the challenge is, how do you get parents involved? And some parents just need more support on that. There are patterns of work, there is shift work, there are all sorts of ways in which it's more difficult to be supporting your child. But we need to really welcome and engage and support parents to be involved, because, as I say, I don't think anything is more important. And by the way, it's not that the parent is able to do the maths homework. That isn't, the evidence doesn't point that way. The evidence is that it's when parents are constantly demonstrating the value in this promise. So if you take my work, saying something like Tower Hamlets, we had parent support that was fantastic. And yet many of the parents might not even be speaking English as their first language, but they carried a virtue, a promise of education was consistent in the way they engage with children. And that resetting our relationship and our partnership with parents is something which we should have used that COVID moment to capture, because parents did change their relationship, and we should have celebrated, recognized and honored that, and used that as a kind of platform for the next phase of work.
And Carl, I know you mentioned various issues schools are facing since the pandemic in terms of behaviour. Obviously, we've heard about attendance as well. Do you think that parents could help with this situation as well? You mentioned it shouldn't all be on schools.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as I said, a lot of these issues are emerging from outside the school gates, and as Kevin says, parents are huge influences, and I think, as he says, we need to do as much as we can, I think, to encourage and enable parents to support their kids. And I think we need to look more at, on a national basis, how we can improve parental engagement in their kids' education. But equally, I think you do have to recognise that, given the challenges that a lot of families face, that you are going to have, very deep inequalities in home learning environments. When you have families on the breadline, families with severe mental health issues, it's very difficult. They're very difficult situations to improve. In terms of, you can't just click your fingers and quite a unstable or difficult, stressful environment at home is going to turn into an incredibly nourishing educational environment. So it's a very tricky issue to solve. I think the job of schools is to try and mitigate it as much as they possibly can, and it's the job of the education system as a whole and government to try and address some of those issues as well, and try and work with parents as much as they can. But it is a very tricky issue to address.
Great. Does Darren or Hannah want to come in on that? Or if not, I'll open it up to wider questions from the audience, because we've got a lot that have come in now. Great. So let me just take a look. So one of the questions we've got here was, how is assessment used now for our youngest children, and how effective is it in supporting them? That's from Helen Garnett and Jackie Harland, co-founders of ARC Pathway. Darren, I don't know if you want to address that, or if anyone else thinks they're best placed to come in on that one.
If we're talking about assessment of children in the early years, I mean, that's a fairly long-standing set of arrangements which have been revised recently, but that's the early years foundation stage and the early years foundation stage profile. And that has a lot of strengths to it. It's very holistic, or it seeks to be holistic. It has in the past been, I think, rather burdensome. Some of the government's recent reforms to the early age foundation stage profile try to address that. We'll have to see how effective those are. So I think those are helpful assessments. I think something that certainly a lot of teachers in the early years that I speak to point out is the sense in which assessments preschool, to what extent do those assessments help inform the way in which learning is tailored to the needs of young people and to the young children? And I think to some extent that speaks to one of the more, I think, unfortunate aspects of education policy development over the past 10 to 14 years, has been the sense in which different agencies for children and perhaps don't communicate and collaborate with each other as well as they used to. And I think there are all kinds of reasons for that. But I think sometimes the experience of teachers in the early years tends to show that if there were better collaboration between agencies for children, so information was being shared, what do we know about children before they start accessing early years education, that might be a step in the right direction. The last Labour government, I'm not making a political point, but the last Labour government was looking at that quite seriously. That work stopped. And I think people are increasingly realizing that one of the solutions to the problems we're looking at is how these different parts of the public sector, how these different public services can be helped to collaborate more effectively. So there's more that could be done in that area, I think.
Great. Anyone want to give their thoughts on that?
I think it's also about how assessment is used, and the consequences of it for schools and educational institutions, and how assessments are interpreted in terms of the incentives that it provides to schools in terms of their intakes, and what schools are focused on doing. And I think there does need to be, the shift from focusing on absolute attainment in terms of numbers of A stars to C, to the Progress 8 measure, I think was a step forward, but Progress 8, which measures the starting point to end point, is certainly not perfect in terms of recognizing the context of the learning of kids in schools, and there's still, unfortunately, in incentives to schools to have more advantaged intakes with fewer challenges. It makes it easier for them in terms of their league tables and also Ofsted grades. And I think we do need to look at building context much deeper into our assessment systems.
Great, thank you.
Ellen, can I just weigh in with one other point about that?
Sure.
With a practical example, because we often obsess in education about assessing what children have learned rather than using assessment to kind of inform our decision making, as Darren was saying. A great example is that we were looking at the children who were struggling to read in Bradford. This is recently, and picking up a study in America. We found that a good chunk, 20% of the kids who were struggling with reading, actually had undiagnosed eyesight issues that hadn't been picked up, and they weren't wearing spectacles. So, and this has been replicated in different jurisdictions around the world, this idea that you assess in order to work out what are some of the barriers that are preventing learning. And that's a very practical one. It's hard to read if you can't see. So, and why haven't you got the glasses? Because all that facility support around you costs money, is difficult. So those children now have glasses. I think the breakfast is a good example again of suddenly you give children a breakfast and attainment improves. So I think this idea of trying to assess some of these barriers in order to tackle them is something we need to use assessment more for, not just measuring have they learned this or that or the other. What are the barriers preventing them from learning?
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Mandy Cheetham. She said, how confident are you that free school meals will be extended to all families on universal credit with a change of government? Hannah, I just wondered if you might want to share your thoughts on that one.
We can be hopeful. It's hard to know, but it's definitely something that we're having a lot of conversation, and there's a huge number of organisations who are really kind of campaigning for this at the moment. I think what we're going to be looking at is the results from what's being done in London at the moment. So for those of you who don't know, London primary schools have rolled out free school meals for everyone this academic year, and it's been committed to for the next academic year too. So I think we'll be looking to the results of that in terms of like proof of concept that this can work, and that there are some of the challenges, but how they may be overcome by like catering teams and things like that, to actually kind of really further develop that evidence base for why this is such an important intervention for our children and for our schools.
Anyone else, Carl or Kevin or Darren, want to speak about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anna spoke to, there is obviously a big debate going on in the Labour Party about free school meals at the moment, and there is I suppose choices to be made in terms of universality versus targeting. I think what's incontrovertible is that the current eligibility does not cover everybody, all families who are in food poverty and all kids who need food. And I think hopefully we can build that consensus and make an improvement on that. Obviously several organizations have settled on universal credit eligibility as a natural criterion. But yeah, I mean, there are difficult choices to make. If you go beyond that, there are difficult choices to make, in terms of, in London, they're looking at universality among primary school pupils, but obviously hunger doesn't end at the end of primary school. There are big issues further down the line. And also we're in a difficult fiscal environment for education spending, and there are a lot of competing things that need to be done to tackle the attainment gap, and there's some difficult decisions to be made about where school funding is directed.
Great, thank you. There's a question here for Sir Kevin. It says, does Kevin have any further explanation of admissions of disadvantaged children into schools, and where some schools are not being inclusive? What's happening in this space? Thank you.
And look, sorry, could you just repeat the beginning of that question?
It says, do you have any further explanation of the admissions of disadvantaged children into schools?
Oh yeah.
Where some schools are not being inclusive? I think you mentioned in your opening remarks around selection.
People probably might not recall this, but when the pupil premium was originally introduced, the idea was that if you attach this 10% additional level of capitation per child, schools might start require or encourage schools to recruit disadvantaged kids into them. That never happened. There hasn't been a redistribution of those children. When you look at the allocation of children against some of our top performing, well, grammar schools definitely, but even our top performing non-grammar schools, and then you look at the level of this kids on free school meals around those schools, you see a strange pattern where those schools aren't serving the population in which they're located. So we have to then ask ourselves the question: why aren't all schools reflecting the communities they serve? And I think that's an admissions question. We know that some schools generate better progress than others. We know that if you get lots and lots of children who are harder to teach, it has an impact on your capacity as a school and the drain on your resources. So my point is that admission should be much more tightly managed to ensure that each school is serving the community, the children of the community around it, and not have these weird disconnects between a school operating in a community with deprivation, but actually not serving those children.
Another question that's kind of around, I guess, the type of school you go to is from Tom Guerrero Davies. He said, what impact, if any, do you think Labour's plan to add VAT to private school fees will have on the attainment gap? Carl, I don't know if you wanted to share Sutton Trust's thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose we've been concentrating on the attainment gap within the state sector. There is obviously an attainment gap between the state sector and the private sector, and one again that widened during the pandemic, narrowed slightly when exams came back in comparison to the teacher assessed grades. Yeah, I think there are a lot of complexities in the Labour VAT plan in terms of the impacts it will have. A lot depends on to what extent private schools pass on those costs to the headline fees. I think we probably will see some redistribution of of kids to the state sector. It's probably not going to be as large as I think some have argued. But I think there will be a challenge for the state sector in what you do then. If there is an influx or even a moderate-sized influx of fairly well-off parents into the state sector, how do we ensure that it doesn't increase inequalities within the state sector? And that again does come back to the admissions question, and making having fairer school admissions that limits the impact of extra parents from wealthy backgrounds accessing the best schools and widening those gaps. And I think that there does need to be some preparation made in advance for that in terms of the school's admissions code. And one of the things the Trust has been campaigning on for the last few years is that schools should be using pupil premium as a priority criterion when they're oversubscribed. And they can currently do that within the school admissions code, but like schools to be required to do that up to a certain level, that would reflect their community. So I think that is an important aspect of the VAT plan in terms of its impact that it may have on the state system.
Great. There's a question here where it says, we've heard from more than one of the speakers about how education can't compensate entirely for the socioeconomic disadvantage present in society at large. Is from Neil Kay, the question. It says, I wonder if the panel could suggest what the next government's wider social policy priorities ought to be in order to reduce inequality and attainment. Darren, I just wondered if you wanted to start with that.
Apologies, my laptop. That's a very big question, and there are lots of things that the future government would need to look at. I think I'd go back to something I said earlier. This may not be the most expensive item on the list. It might be a challenging one to take forward, but it is that sense in which you have multi-agency cooperation and partnership at a national level and at a local level as well. I mean, there were, prior to 2010, you had children and young people's trusts, which were established in every local authority, bringing all those services, health, social care, youth and community services, criminal justice services together to share expertise and develop multi-agency strategic plans. And what's happened, I think, over the last decade and a half is that you've seen a bit of siloing, if you like, of different services that have been working to particular objectives that just relate to that particular service. The kind of interactions and partnership between different agencies, that's been undermined. And we see that in areas like special educational needs and disabilities, for example, where education, health and social care don't always work together as well as they could, because to some extent a problem aired is a problem shared. And if those agencies work together, then creative solutions could be found. So if I had to have one recommendation, would be to revisit this issue around multi-agency working, collaboration between schools, between local authorities, and between social services and other key public services as well.
Great. Hannah, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly, I guess so. I definitely think there's a need for cross-government working. So I would say at the moment, a lot of the issues that we work on sort of very much around food sort of fall within Department of Education, but I think there's a role for other departments to also be contributing and recognizing that this isn't just an education issue. I think broadly, we need to be looking at the sort of the benefits and the nutritional safety nets that are in place for those disadvantaged households, whether that is free school meals, whether it's a review of the benefits that are sort of there for families, the child benefit system, etc. And then I think the other policy area, which is sort of outside the direct remit of this webinar, but we do a lot of work around sort of fiscal interventions to incentivize companies to create healthier food, so putting a levy on unhealthy food. And I think there are options like that for the government to look at to raise revenue, which can then be used to support programs like breakfasts and things like that. So I think this is again where that kind of cross-government bigger picture sort of focus on our children and their needs is really needed, because it's not just about what sort of the Department of Education can do. It's that wider system, and we need to get much better at linking up the different departments in that regard.
So Kevin, what would be your top recommendation?
When you introduced me at the beginning, you talked about the catch-up czar. I actually asked and tried to shift it to the childhood recovery. So I think there's a general question about looking at childhood in England across the piece. I completely agree with Darren about these localized, and it has to be done locally, not nationally. What do we know about the integration and alignment of local services for children? I think that's fragmented and broken. I think at the family level, how do we better support parental leave and family support, in a way that gives children the very best start? But I guess in the end, all of this is driven by wealth and by the distribution of wealth. And so economic growth is the fundamental driver that's going to improve childhood in this country, because we're basically too many families are living with incomes that are too low. And the social issue, I'm banging on now, but the social issue I've linked to it, we haven't mentioned, is housing. The housing crisis, yes, it has a big impact on young people trying to get on the ladder, but there's also many families that are living in overcrowded accommodation where children have no space to learn and play. So there's so many dimensions to this, but basically it's looking across the piece at childhood and asking ourselves, what is it that's giving children in England a childhood which really shouldn't be the childhood we expect of one of the most successful economies in the world.
Thank you. I know we're running out of time, Carl. Was there anything you just wanted to add?
Yeah, I would echo the issue around a kind of collapse in the wider social services for children over the last 10 to 15 years, and education's been out on its own in lots of ways, and schools bearing the brunt of those, the kind of defunding of wider services. But I'd also add that the eye has been taken off the ball, I would say, on the issue of child poverty. It was removed from the remit of the Social Mobility Commission, and I think we do need to look at issues of inequality and opportunity and life chances do need to be looked at together with underlying issues of poverty and economic inequality. And I think we need to view that in a more holistic way going forward.
Great, thank you. Well, all of the thoughts have been very, very interesting from you all. Obviously, lots of different ideas there for how we tackle this growing problem of the attainment gap. Hopefully we'll have some answers when we get some of the election manifestos on what the parties are planning to do and what they're planning to prioritise. But I think this has been a really interesting discussion on what some of those key issues need to be looked at. And it's been really, really interesting to hear some of the ideas around kind of what schools can do, but also how it's not just schools, it's parents, it's politicians, it's everyone, if we're going to tackle this problem and try and reverse some of that progress that was made in the 2010s. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much to all our speakers, to Hannah, to Darren, to Sir Kevin, and to Carl. And thank you very much for everyone for listening today. And yeah, hope you have a lovely day.